Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another session of Leadership in Politics with Dr. Abraham. With me today is Paul Smith. He has redefined the art of storytelling. His insights will be shared with us today. Mr. Paul, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you. Thank you for making the time in this uncertain time. So I very much appreciate you. For those who don't know you, please introduce yourself. Who is Paul?
Yeah, so I'm a guy who spent most of my career in typical corporate jobs. I spent 20 years working at the Procter and Gamble company, but along the way just got fascinated with this concept of storytelling. And 8 years ago, ended up writing my first book on the topic, and that ended up leading to a whole different career for me. As you and I just talked earlier, I think my fifth book just came out a few months ago, and so in the last 8 years, I completely shifted from being a corporate employee to being a full-time author and speaker and trainer on the subject of the art and the science of storytelling at work. So to help you be a better leader, a better salesperson, better marketer, better engineer, etc. So that's what I do full-time now.
What was your first book? What's the name of your first book, the first one you published?
Yeah, Lead with a Story. So it was about leadership storytelling. My second was actually Parenting with a Story, which I know might sound odd, but yeah, it was Lead with a Story was first, and then Parenting with a Story, and then Sell with a Story for sales and marketing people. So I didn't really set out to write a trilogy, but I guess it kind of ended up that way. And then the fourth one was the 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, and then the most recent one that I mentioned earlier was 4 Days with Kenny Tedford.
We'll talk about all of them. What seems to me, you're not just writing stories, you're on a mission. You're on a mission because it seems there's a purpose behind your writing. One for leaders, parents, and also for salespeople, although it's in the corporate world and within organizations. So, but your mission is to really help inspire others through your writing as well. That's what I gathered.
Yeah, I mean, clearly you want your stories to do that. And I hope that the books that I write, people find inspiring, but I'm also very intentionally trying to teach them something. I'm trying to teach them the art and the science of storytelling so that they can do it as well. Because it's not really that hard. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? It's storytelling, but surprisingly, a lot of people just don't know how to do it well because we were never taught. Like nobody sits you down and teaches you storytelling. Well, they'll teach you math and science and English and, but they don't teach you storytelling unless you get a degree in, I don't know, narrative fiction.
But the point is you have redefined the art of storytelling. It's not the storytelling Adam and Eve anymore. What you provide in your writing, in a different dimension, a different concept. Storytelling is about inspiring. Storytelling is about influencing. Storytelling is about how to motivate your employees and to be the best leader you can be. Storytelling is how you control your emotions and use your emotions in delivering a message, right? So it's inspiring comes out of it.
Yeah, it's not just to entertain people. Yeah, storytelling to entertain people we've been doing that for eons, and there are probably much better people than me in Hollywood to teach you how to tell entertaining stories. But if you want to learn how to tell stories that actually accomplishes an objective, like leading an organization or selling or marketing a product or teaching your children wisdom and character, that's the kind of storytelling that I traffic in.
The first one who told you a story was your father. He's still with us, your father?
He is, thankfully.
Okay,
he is.
Thankfully. Thanks God. So he was the first one who told you a story when you were at a moment when you said, I need to make a decision.
Yeah.
So tell us what happened.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to when I was trying to decide to quit my corporate job and become a full-time author. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I decided logically that I wanted to do it, but I just didn't have the courage to go through with it. So he was 80 years old, I think, at the time. And so I wrote him a letter to ask for his advice. I mean, you're never too old to learn from somebody older and wiser. And he's hard of hearing now. So I had to write him a letter, and I wrote him and I told him my quandary, and I thought he'd write me back and just tell me one of two things, right? He's either going to say, absolutely, son, go follow your dream. I believe in you, be a cheerleader, dad.
Yeah.
Or he was going to be the practical dad and say, look, son, just, keep your head down, do your job for the next 10 years, and then you can retire and be financially comfortable and then go pursue all this silly writing book business. But he didn't do either of those things, right? He just told me a story about himself that I'd never heard before. He said, when I was 5 years old, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. He said, I wanted to be a singer, you know, like Frank Sinatra or Tony Bennett. And he said, I knew that for sure the first day of the first grade, because the teacher asked any of us, all the kids, if any of us had any special talent. He said, I raised my hand and I said, I can sing. And despite the fact that he never sung in front of anybody but his mom in the kitchen. So, well, what do you think the teacher did when he said that?
When he said that, he said, go ahead and sing.
Yeah, of course.
Go ahead and
Bobby,
sing. Yeah,
sing us a song.
Serious. Of course, he wants to encourage him. Yeah.
So 5-year-old Bobby gets up and he belts out his favorite song right there, a cappella. And he said, I nailed it, right? I got all the words right, all the melody. I was so proud. He said the students and the teacher stood up and they applauded me. I got a standing ovation my first time to sing in front of an audience. But he went on in this letter to say, but that turned out not to be only the first time I ever sang in front of an audience. It turned out to be the last time.
Why did that happen?
Yeah, well, and he told me, he said, because I just didn't have the courage to go through with it. And he said, there's not a month that goes by in the last 75 years that I haven't regretted that decision. And he said, someday you're going to wake up, you're going to be 80 years old like me, and it'll be too late to pursue your dream.
And that's all you needed.
But he gave me he went one better than that. He said, he closed the letter by saying, I'd love to see you achieve your dream. That doesn't mean in your lifetime, son. That means in mine. And I mean, I thought, you know, he's 80 years old, like that, you know, TikTok, right?
Expectations so high. He put you on a high pedestal.
He laid down the gauntlet in front of me. And so literally 2 days later, I walk into my boss's office and I resigned from my 20-year career. And that story is why. Now, I eventually would have done it, but nowhere near that quickly. And that story gave me the courage to go do it.
So he motivated you and he told you what to do to make a decision through storytelling. And from this legend, your dad, you continued that process of assisting others and helping them, especially leaders, helping them to make decisions, make stories, tell stories, but not all the time stories. You kind of combine it with traditional ways of delivering messages, communications.
In fact, I would give you a number. I would tell you that the storytelling you do should probably only be 10 to 15% of the words coming out of your mouth should be in the form of a story.
What's the purpose of the story? Why do you want to tell a story? What's the impact? I'm looking for the impact you'll have on your audience.
Yeah, well, so the biggest one is that it helps people make decisions because, you know, what we know, and you probably study this as well as I have, the way that humans make decisions, it doesn't work the way we assumed it did. Like we like to think that we make these logical, rational decisions. And it turns out many, if not most of our decisions are made in a subconscious emotional processing part of the brain. Mm-hmm. And then we rationalize those decisions logically a few nanoseconds later in a logical, conscious thinking part of the brain. And so we leave a decision thinking that we made it for the logical reasons, but the truth is our kind of reptilian brain decided for us earlier, and the rest of our brain is just trying to catch up with why. Mm-hmm. And stories are just better at reaching both parts of the brain, whereas our rational, logical argumentation only reaches that one part of the brain, and you really do need both.
Mm-hmm. So in these books you have, what do you provide there? Tell me a little bit a premise of each book, if you may. You have 3 books, one for parents, one for leaders, one for Salesforce. Yeah. And then you also, the 4th book, if you can give me a minute of each. Yeah. And then we go to your latest book.
Yep. Yeah. So lead with a story. There are 2 parts to the book. What stories you need to tell as a leader, and then how to tell them. So what stories you need to tell, I cover 20 some odd different types of stories that leaders might need to tell, like, you know, setting a vision or leading change or getting people motivated for their job or helping them find passion for their work or, things like that. Okay. Helping people be more creative and innovative or help them to be better problem solvers or deliver feedback in a way that would be viewed as a gift. These are all leadership jobs that you need. So the first part of the book is really just a set of stories to give you examples of the type of stories you should be telling. The rest of the book is how to do it. So what's the structure of a well-told story? What are techniques to create the right emotional engagement? What are techniques to create a surprise ending? You know, how long should the stories be? What level of detail should you go into? So the nuts and bolts of how to do it. And then Sell with a Story follows the same premise. Here are the 25 stories that salespeople need to tell, not leaders. salespeople. And there's one example of each of these stories. And then similar on the how. What's the right structure, the right emotional engagement techniques, the right surprise. And those are very similar between the two books.
And
what stories you tell are different.
And the good thing about these books, you don't just make the stories, you actually interview people. You interview leaders, you interview salespeople, and you get the experience from people who are practicing it. Is that right?
Oh yeah, I've probably interviewed over 300 people as part of writing these books. Yeah, so these stories come from 25 countries around the world. So,
in the fields.
Yeah, so the parenting story, parenting with a storybook is a little bit different in that none of it is about how to tell these stories. The parenting book is simply a collection of 101 short stories, true stories from people that I interviewed around the world, each of which teaches a unique character lesson that children need to learn. You know, so it might be about honesty or integrity or hard work or fairness or patience or kindness or positive mental attitude, all the character traits that we all want our kids to have. There are stories, there's a one chapter on each character trait and a handful of stories for each one to help teach that story, as opposed to just telling your kids that you should be honest,
Yes.
So it's really a resource for parents to use when they're struggling with, a particular character.
That book was also a bestseller?
Well, I wish it was. That one was not. So the lead with the story was, and the sell with the story was, and 10 stories has been. So yeah, not all of mine have been bestsellers, but I've got a pretty decent track record.
You're still too early. I mean, you still have a lot of things to give.
Yeah.
And then the fourth one?
Yeah, the fourth one is the 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. It's my shortest book. Like, you literally could read this book in about an hour. And so all it is the 10 most important stories that I think any leader needs to be able to tell. And I wrote it because, I think there's 115 stories in my first book and 101 in my second book and 40 or 50 in my third book. And, I was getting feedback that, gosh, Paul, those are all great, but like, where do I start? What are the most, and that's very fair feedback. So I wrote a very short book. There are only 10 stories in it. And it's the 10 most important stories I think leaders should tell. And if you want, I can just tell your audience right now what the 10 are.
Please do.
Yeah. So the first 4 kind of go together because they're about setting direction for the organization. So it's where we came from. That's a founding story. Why we can't stay there. So that's a case for change story. Where we're going, which is a vision story. How we're going to get there, which is a strategy story. Strategy is about how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. So that's the first 4. The second 4 go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization.
The value.
So that's, so that defines us. So it's what we believe. So that's a corporate values story. Who we serve. So that's a customer story, a story about your customer. What we do for our customers. So that's kind of a classical sales story. And how we're different from our competitors. So I call that a marketing story because marketing is typically about differentiating yourself from your competitors. So I think that's only 8. So we got 2 more. So those last 2 kind of go together as well, but they're more personal to you, the leader. So number 9 is why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. And number 10 is why you should want to work here. So it's a recruiting story to get talented people to come to your organization and stay and work there, right? So those I think are the most important 10. There are dozens of stories that leaders need to tell, but if I had to pick the 10 most important ones to start with, it would be those.
Because what you created with those 10 steps, this is really a way of a leader to organize his organization to a level of success and being effective. Is no nonsense. Just said, that's what you need. Put those in place and you will have an effective organization.
I mean, I didn't choose them at random, obviously.
Exactly.
If a leader can do all of these things, explain where we came from, why we can't stay there, where we're going, how we're going to get there, who we serve, what we believe. I mean, if you can do that, you should have a successful organization. It's leaders who don't know them.
Because there are some successful organizations, even successful leaders, but they're not effective. And that success with time will fade away. But effective, especially with a solid organization like this, they'll be effective and they will stay with us generation after generations. So, congratulations on this. Yeah.
It basically gives you one example of each of those 10 stories and then a few tips for how you can craft your own. So it's very, very short read.
So I'm trying to see how, I mean, your books are definitely insightful, informative, but I'm trying to see the secret sauce, why they made it to the bestseller. What do you
You
share?
know, I'd like to tell you that I have all the secrets for that, and I clearly don't, because you know, at least one or my other two have not reached that status yet. So I haven't figured out how to replicate it every time. But I can tell you that first of all, I followed an old-fashioned production or publication process. So none of my books are self-published. They're all published by big reputable New
Traditional.
York City publishing houses.
Is that a one way of why people, you think self-published book, they can't make it to the bestsellers?
No, they can, but it's just much harder, and
Okay.
your odds of success are much lower,
Okay.
because the bigger publishing
Promotion.
companies, they'll help you promote it. They'll get you. You know, my first publisher got me into Forbes magazine and the Wall Street Journal and Time, and and they got tour in the country, and they were pushing the book overseas and got it translated into 11 different languages. And self-published books, you have to do all that yourself, and it's just really hard to do. So that's one thing is, if you really want it to be a bestseller.
The first one is obtain the services of a independent publisher that will take you to the second level.
Yeah,
so that's one.
Yeah, I just say a full service publishing company.
Full service publishing.
Yeah, as opposed to a self-publishing or hybrid publisher. Okay. I don't want to knock those. I mean, those are good for other reasons. But if you really want to have a top seller, your odds
Basically,
will be the best.
What you're sharing is what works.
Yeah.
What will work?
Or at least
it's
what's worked for me.
Yes.
So some of it would be the way you promote the book. So you've got to be willing to, do speaking engagements, and there's a promotional effort that is required. You can't just write your book and throw your hands up and say, "Okay, I'm done," and now I'll hope it'll become a bestseller.
The best promotion is self-promotion, Paul, right?
Yeah,
it is. What's the third thing?
Well, don't be afraid to hire somebody to help you with that promotion. So this is a mistake I made early on that I won't make again. I was afraid to hire, a PR firms or anybody to help promote the book, because I thought, it won't pay out in terms of, I could spend $10,000 hiring a PR firm, and it won't sell enough extra books to make it worth the expense. But really, the business I'm in, I'm selling myself as a speaker and trainer and coach. And that's where I make 95% of my revenue comes from that.
The book could be given for free for all you can.
Exactly. So don't make the mistake of under investing in the success of your book because you think that, well, I'll never make enough royalties on the book to justify that cost of promotion. Don't think of it that way. Think of it as the book is the investment in your speaking business. And so don't limit yourself. I think that was a mistake I made early on that I've tried to not make since.
So make the money and let people make the money along the way with you.
Yeah.
They will take it to the next level. Thank you for sharing that. Let's go to the fifth book, 4 Days with Kenny Tedford.
Yeah.
Is it published already? Is it out already?
Yeah, it's out. It came out, I think, in December. Okay. This will absolutely be the most important, most meaningful book that I've written or ever will. I'm convinced. This is the biography of a cognitively impaired, deaf, and partially blind man named Kenny Tedford. The book's name is 4 Days with Kenny Tedford. And the book is essentially about the 4 days that he spent at my house with me interviewing him so that I could write his life story. So I was going to write this book about him. And it started out, it was just going to be me writing a straight third-person biography of his life. And it turned into a book that's fairly different than that. It ended up being a book not only about him, but about the impact he was having on me and my family through this process. So I am now a character in the book. My wife and my 2 sons are now a character in the book, because what you'll see is I've essentially kind of transcribed the interview with him, and you'll see him tell one part of his life story, and then I will reflect on it. And my wife reflects on it, and you see the impact it had on my kids and how it made them feel, and how it made me think about my parenting, and how it made me think about my life, and how blessed I am, and how maybe I should treat people differently. And so it became a very different book than it started out, and I think that made it much better.
More engaging and involved.
Yeah.
Tell us, who is Kenny? Why did you choose Kenny?
So
why Kenny? Why not another person?
Yeah. Well, so I never met anybody like him in my life until the day I met him. And you, in the first chapter of the book, you find out how we met. So I won't spoil that. But the point is, you know, imagine meeting someone who's deaf in both ears,
Mm.
partially blind in one eye, couldn't speak until the age of 10. So kind of like Helen Keller, right? You know, deaf and mute and partially blind, but also with a cognitive disability, a significant learning disability, so that he cognitively tests at about the third grade level. All right. But he's a grown man. He's 65 years old now. So in that way, he's kind of like Forrest Gump, even though Forrest Gump's fictional. But imagine meeting somebody who's got the physical challenges of a Helen Keller with the mental cognitive challenges of a Forrest Gump, and combine them. And that is Kenny Tedford. And I just never met anybody like that in my life. And I assumed that if that was me, I would just be a bitter, angry person. I'd be bitter at the world for dealing me such a challenging life situation. And he's not. He's the most charming man I ever met. And that just fascinated me. And I had to know why. How can you be so happy?
So
I would just
accepting,
be
contented. Yeah.
you know, yeah. And so I got to learn that throughout the process of learning about him and writing his life story. I got to figure it out. And that's some of the conclusion you'll see at the end of the book. The last chapter of the book is a set of life lessons, both for people with disabilities and a whole different list for people who love someone who has a disability, how to be better support them. So like 15 or 16 life lessons in both parts of that chapter that I think make it a really meaningful book. Yeah.
I love the fact you're doing what you're doing. You are really on a mission, and an author, a good human being, because you're providing a purpose in a mission to these writings. So your messages, regardless what field you're writing to, there's always a message of being better. And that's what I call it also, the art of serving others. You serve others through your writing. I attempt to serve others and do a social change, a social justice through my writings, but you actually put it in writing and you're having an impact. So congratulations. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Are those books all available on, how would people be able to get them? Amazon, what else?
Yeah, I think they're all on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and most of the places, online places you'd buy books. They're in, you know, regular print editions and Kindle, and 3 of them are available in Audible. Also.
Ladies and gentlemen, the author is Paul Smith, a man on a mission, an author on a mission to be an instrument of good toward others. What else do you want to share with us?
You know, I guess if I could leave you with one piece of advice, it would be tell better stories. And I think you'll be more effective in just about every avenue of your life, at work and at home.
Is that your message to leaders too?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I guess I would support that by saying, think of storytelling like any other leadership or business skill, in that it's something that if you want to get better at, you need to study it. You know, don't just assume, well, if I'm not a good storyteller, I guess I never will be. No, it's like any other skill, like any other art form, music or dance or, you know, whatever. If you're no good at it, well, go take some lessons, right? Read a book, watch a video, take a class. You can learn to be a better storyteller, just like anything else.
A lead with a story, does it give the readers steps by step how to be a good storyteller?
Yeah, they're in there.
It does. Now, as I gathered from your writing, storytelling is no longer just a story, it's to inspire others. And to inspire others, you need to be self-aware. You need to be emotionally stable and know exactly what you're doing. That's the question. Do you think emotionally intelligent people, leaders or otherwise, are more keen to be better storytellers by default, or learning the skills of storytelling is a must?
I think almost anybody can improve their storytelling skills with some training. There are some people who are naturally gifted at it and need less help than others. That's for sure. But I think the people who have a high degree of emotional intelligence do tend to be better storytellers, not because they know the mechanics of storytelling better than anybody else, but because they're willing to tell better stories. They're willing to tell stories that make them vulnerable, right? They're willing to tell their failure stories, their stories of when they made mistakes, such that other people can learn from them. And those are some of the most important stories leaders will ever tell. Whereas leaders who are not emotionally intelligent and are not very generous and are more self-conscious and less self-confident refuse to tell those stories. And that makes them a worse storyteller, because they're, they may have the same skill from a a
Technical.
delivery standpoint, but they're refusing to tell the most important stories because their emotional IQ is too low.
Emotional IQ is too low, and their empathy is non-existent.
Right. Yes.
So I also sense empathy in your writing, because when you write, you don't just write because you want to write. You write because you want to inform and influence and inspire. Where does your empathy come from? Where did it come from?
I think it comes from being on the receiving end of hard times, right? From fail, I've failed and
Tell
had
me
to
your
get back
story.
up.
Tell us your story. What's your story?
Well, I mean, I got fired from my first job twice. My life has not been full of only successes, right? I've been, I was like any other kid. When you're 10 years old, there's always somebody bigger and stronger and bullies you. And I've been on the receiving end of almost all of, well, that's not true. Not all of life's injustices, but enough of them that I learned from that. And most of us do. And I don't want my fellow human beings to suffer any of the failures that I've had. I want you to learn from my failures. Several of the stories in my books are stories of my business failures that I want you to learn from.
Thank you for sharing that, because empathy, I've seen it throughout my interviews with thought leaders, even leaders that I consulted on a professional level. Empathy has to be part of the equation at all time. Whether you're an author, best-selling author, whether you're a leader for a small organization or a multi-million-dollar company organization. Give me a good structure of a story. What would be a good structure our audience can take away and benefit from?
Yeah, so I think good stories do have a good structure, right? Bad stories don't have much of a structure. They're kind of a rambling, run-on mess, right? So I think having a good structure is critical to having an effective story. And I've researched all kinds of story structures, and there are many that will work, but what I found works best with my audiences, my business audiences, is explaining the 8 questions that your story needs to answer. Okay. And the order in which you should answer them, as opposed to talking about, well, there's the context and the challenge and the conflict and the resolution. Those just sound rather academic to my audiences. So there are 8 questions I think your story needs to answer. And here they are. First of all, why should I bother listening to your story? Right? You've got to give them a reason to listen first. Once you've done that, you've kind of earned the right to answer the next 5 questions. Where and when did it happen? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? Right now, that should sound like the natural flow of a story, because it is the natural flow of a story, but I think that's only 6, right? So there's 2 questions left. What did you learn from the story? And what should I go do now? That's me, the person you're telling the story to, right? That's your opportunity to make a recommendation. So if you think about that, the first question you've gotten their attention, so they'll listen to the story. The next 5 questions, you're telling the main story, the action of the story. And the last 2 questions you're answering, you're making sure that you're accomplishing your leadership objective. You're making sure they've learned the right lesson and that they're going to go do what you need them to go do. So if you follow that structure, you're much more likely to have an effective business story, leadership story, sales story, and parenting story, whatever. And you're more likely to be able to tell the story in a short amount of time and in an order that makes sense, right? Because these stories need to be, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes at most. Yeah, these are short stories, and it's hard to tell a short story unless you're following a structure, a tight structure.
And this is where the learning skills comes into play. You just can't say, I can do it because I'm emotionally intelligent. Right. You may, but you really have to learn it.
Yeah, there are techniques to all this stuff. Right?
These techniques, did you come up with them, or were they part of the culture out there?
Yeah, you're always standing on the shoulders of giants behind you,
Mm-hmm.
you know, underneath you, right? So, I mean, I've read countless books on the art and the science of storytelling, and I've learned from some of the best. But what I've put together here, these 8 are mine. It's kind of my
Those are
intellectual
yours.
property. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it made the most sense to me after learning I mean, there are 17, 20 step, you know, plot structures that you can study out there. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey storytelling structure. I mean, that works if you're going to write your first screenplay or write a 300-page novel, knock yourself out with those. But I find that a shorter structure works better for business people who need to tell stories in 2 minutes.
2 minutes, and there's no time to waste.
Right.
No time to waste. So there's this idea there that when you're presenting something, start with a story. Start with a story. You tell a story. And some people, Simon Sinek is good in it. He tells a story. I don't know if it's the same purpose like what you have to inspire, but he's also an effective speaker. But what I'm sensing, the story other speakers tell within the presentation, that's not what you're talking about.
So what I'm not talking about when I say lead with a story, I don't really mean lead off, like kick off your meeting with a joke or an anecdote or something to break the ice and then get into your main content. That's not what I mean. I mean, use stories to actually deliver your leadership message. And it can be anywhere within your speech, within your memo, within your hallway conversation. It could be at the beginning, it could be the middle, it could be the end, it could be all three. You know, doesn't really matter. I mean, do leadership via storytelling to make you more effective.
That's
Yeah, it's
wonderful.
not just an ice-breaking exercise.
What's your message to millennials out there in this uncertain time? Give me a message to millennials, plus after this, to leaders, especially in this uncertain time.
My experience with millennials is that they grew up in an age of social media and Twitter, and they're used to communicating in very short, you know, choppy sentences and emoticons and things that older people like me are not as used to communicating in. And so I think they have a unique challenge in learning to tell stories because their starting point is somewhere different. Their starting point is very short back and forth communication as opposed to communicating an entire story. Whereas older people, I think, you know, in my age group are used to writing long memos, you know, and their problem is they need to get shorter. They need to be able to get terser. Whereas the millennial group, I think they need to learn to get comfortable to expand on a little bit on their idea. You can tell a story in 2 or 3 minutes. Spend a little bit more time. Your audience is not going to get scared.
And for leaders, give me like in uncertain times.
Yeah, in uncertain times. Yeah. So I think there's a whole host of stories that leaders need to tell in times of crisis to help navigate the situation. Some of it is to calm the organization and reassure them that things will be okay. You know, one of my favorites is that the CEO of Procter & Gamble, you know, when this crisis started, in fact, not this crisis, but the one before, got his leadership team together and read to them a newspaper article. And the headline of the newspaper article was, will Procter & Gamble survive? And then it talked about all the terrible things going on at the company and the financial disaster, and speculated that the company was going to go bankrupt and all this stuff. And he finished reading this newspaper story and he looked up at his audience and he said, that article was written 125 years ago in our local newspaper. Articles like that have been written about every 25 years. There's a story like that comes out because we go through some crisis.
Yes.
This isn't our first crisis and it won't be our last crisis.
So your message is a message of hope. There is always tomorrow. You will do the best you can do to make the most of it. Paul, I thank you. Thank you for making the time, for your insight, and continue doing the excellent work.
You as well. Yeah, you as well. Cheers.
God bless. Thank you. Bye-bye now.